our PMP certification training. My name is Obalim. I'm a project professional as well as a business analyst. So I'm going to be your guide in the course of this particular training. So what you're looking at now is basically an introduction to PMP. So what we're going to be doing in this particular session is basically talking about what the PMP is all about. And then also I'm going to give you an overview of everything that the PMP is all about. So which is part of the reason why we're making this particular video free for you, so that after watching this video you can actually evaluate and be able to determine if the PMP course is one key thing you might want to do, and then also if you would like to pursue a career in project management. So we're going to be taking a look at these interesting topics in the very first part of our discussion. We're going to be talking about what the PMP is, and then also what we mean by the PMI. Then also we're going to be taking a look at what it requires you to be eligible for the PMP certification exam, which is what we refer to as a requirement for the PMP examination. And then also we're going to also show you the guidelines that you need to follow in order to fill up your PMP application. So in essence, if you want to apply for the exam, what exactly do you need to do to be able to apply for the exam? Then of course we shall describe what we refer to as the PMP exam outline, and then also talk about the syllabus, which is basically what this particular training would be about. So after we have been able to discuss this, we shall also take an overview of all the processes, the knowledge areas, as well as the process groups that we have in the PMP. This is basically part of what we're going to be discussing. Don't forget that our reference point is the PIM box 6. So we have the PIM box 6. That is the latest version of the PIM box guide. Of course, as the PIM box gets reviewed, we shall also keep updating this particular course. So the moment you have a lifetime access, be sure that you're going to always have the updated version as the PMP keeps getting updated. So of course, after this particular part, when we talk about the PMP exam outline as well as the syllabus, we're going to take a look at these other topics. Of course, that is if you decide to go ahead with the course, which of course would include the definition for project. We shall also talk about the definition for the role of a project manager. Then also how project benefits project delivery. We're going to take a look at some case studies here to be able to see exactly how project management methodology, which is the PMP that we're learning about, would help us in being able to effectively deliver project on schedule and then also within budget. Then also we shall distinguish between some key terms that we use in project management, some terms like portfolio, program, as well as projects. Then of course we'll talk about stakeholders, and then also talk about their value to project effort. And finally, we shall also talk about the skills that the project manager needs in order to effectively carry out project. So all of these are part of what we're going to be discussing in the very first chapter of this particular training, which of course is introduction to the PMP. So of course I can't wait to dive in, and if you're with me, we can go in straight ahead and be able to determine exactly what this particular training is all about. So first of all, let's talk about the PMI as well as the PMP. Well, by virtue of the fact that you are looking at this particular course, I want to assume that to a large extent you would have been able to know what the PMP is all about, and then also what PMI simply means. But then also a good professional doesn't mind being reminded. So the PMI simply means Project Management Institute. So the Project Management Institute is basically the body that is responsible for certification in project management, known as the PMP. So just like you have a university, and then a university offers certain courses, for example, say engineering. So this university is synonymous to what we refer to as a PMP. In other words, this university is actually an institute, and then it's an institute, and then the course, which is the engineering, is one of the courses that the university offers. Same also the PMI offers a course in project management known as the Project Management Professional, which for short we refer to as the PMP. Of course, don't forget that the PMI also has other certifications. For example, there's the PMI RMP, that is the Risk Management Professional. There's also the PMI PBA, that is the That is the PMI business analysis. And then of course we also have the PGMP, and that is what we refer to as the program management professional, as well as the PFMP, that is the portfolio management professional. So these are some of the courses that the PMI actually offers, other than the project management professional, which is arguably the most popular one that the PMI actually offers. Now when you get certified, there's what we now refer to as the CCR. CCR simply means continuing certification requirement. Now, what does this mean? It simply means that the PMI expects you to maintain your certification over the years. In other words, as much as possible, the moment you get certified, you need to continually keep updating your certification so that you stay relevant with practices within the industry, and then also some evolving trends within the industry. And that's exactly what the continuing certification requirements refers to. So any hour spent in personal development will earn you what we refer to as a professional development unit. So you need to report what we refer to as, you need to report 60 PDUs, that is 60 professional development units, in order to maintain your certification. And how do you earn these PDUs? Is by taking up further professional certifications or training, as the case may be. And then aside from that, also you can also earn PDUs by attending webinars on PMI website, taking part in local chapter meetings as well as activities, volunteering, writing articles or books, and then also effectively also contributing to the knowledge of project management. All of these are ways you can actually earn professional development unit, which would help you meet the requirements of the CCR, and then ultimately would help you in being able to maintain your certification. So look at the PDUs more like what you need to constantly report once you get certified in order for you to be able to maintain your certification. Of course, like I mentioned earlier on, our reference point is going to be the PMBOK. PMBOK simply refers to a guide to the project management body of knowledge. So this is the guide that actually guides or helps us to be able to determine effectively how to be able to carry out project. And then of course beyond that, notice that this is also the textbook from which the examination is set, and that's going to be our reference point for the purpose of this particular training. Talking about the PMI, remember we said earlier on that the PMI is an organization that is responsible for certification in project management, known as the PMP. And then the PMI is also the body that conducts and supervises the PMP examinations. Currently, the PMI uses the Pearson View. The PMI uses Pearson View to carry out its examination, and then don't forget that you can actually take the examination online from the comfort of your home or office. You can also take the exam at the closest Pearson View test center. These are places where you can actually take the exam once you desire to take the exam. So once you are PMP certified, then like I mentioned earlier on, you now need to keep reporting your professional development unit in order to maintain your certification. And the PMP certification is valid for 3 years. So in essence, after every 3 years, you are expected to renew your certification in order for you to maintain your PMP certification. Again, how you renew your certification is by reporting 60 PDUs, which is of course is equivalent to 20 PDUs per year. So you're expected to earn 20 PDUs per year, and then of course after that you now pay your renewal fee to be able to remain within the PMP certification. So these are some of the requirements for you to be eligible for the certification exam. We have two different categories here. You have category 1. So for category 1, this basically takes a look at those who have a minimum of bachelor's degree. So if you have a minimum of bachelor's degree, you are expected to have what we refer to as 35 contact hours of project management training. So in essence, this would of course would include this particular training, all the workshops, all the exercises, the assignments, as well as all the case studies that we're going to be presenting you. And then also forget all the hours you're going to spend in the review of the question. So all of this together will add up to 35 hours, which is part of what you require to be able to write the PMP certification exam. And then, of course, you also require what we refer to as 4,500 hours leading and directing project. So what that simply means is you must have spent a minimum of 4,500 hours leading as well as directing project for you to be eligible for the PMP exam. And then you must also have at least 3 years experience in project management within the last 8 consecutive years for you to be eligible for the PMP examination, which is of course part of what we take a look at under the category 1. Now in the category 2, which is if you're a high school graduate, you would also require the 35 contact hours of project management education. However, you require longer number of hours with regards to experience leading and directing projects, which of course amounts to 7,500 hours in all, as well as 60 months within the last consecutive years. So in essence, this is the project experience that you need to have, which in this case translates into 5 years project experience for you to be able or eligible for the PMP exam. So for you to write the PMP exam, you need to submit your application at pmi.org and then pay a membership fee of $129 with an application fee of $10. Now, this would bring your fee up to $139. So the $139 is the fee that you basically pay for the PMP examination. Now, for you to renew your certification, that is after you get certified, you now need to be able to pay $129. So $129 is the amount that it will require you to renew your PMP certification. So the exam costs $555 in all, and that is if you're writing the exam as a non-member. However, if you choose to write the exam through the membership route, that is if you become a member of the PMI, then the exam fee drops to $405. So it saves you a lot of money if you actually write the exam as a member. So usually I recommend that you write the exam as a member. And then don't forget, like I mentioned earlier on, if you want to become a member, it will cost you $129 plus an additional $10 application fee, which of course would amount to $139. There's also what we refer to as local chapter membership. So the local chapter membership is usually optional in the course of filling out the application. So you can actually decide to either join the local membership or you decide not to. So once you've been able to pay the exam fee, PMI will send you an authorization letter to take the exam, either at an authorized training center, either at an authorized testing center, or take the exam online like I mentioned earlier on. Now, don't forget that the examination must be written within a year of receiving the authorization letter. So in essence, once you get your eligibility from PMI, you must have to write your exam within 12 months of that eligibility. Please note that sometimes PMI randomly selects applications for audit. So when your application is selected for audits, sometimes it might not be because you did not fill out the application very well. It's just basically a way of PMI determining that the data that they capture about individuals are actually the correct data. So in the course of the audit, they will ask you to send supporting documents that will prove that you have this experience, you meet this experience requirement, as well as this number of hours requirement, and then also the project management training requirement. So these are some of the things that you will be asked to submit by the PMI. So of course, if you have your training completion certificate, and then also you have the number of hours that you've participated in project handy, then it might really not be a very difficult situation for you to pass the audit. But for more information, you can refer to the PMP handbook within the PMI website. So if you go to the PMI website, you get to see the PMP handbook, which is of course available for free. So this handbook would give you detailed explanations of all of the things that we have discussed in this very slide. So if you want to carry out the PMP examination registration, so these are basically the guidelines to help you to complete the PMP application. So first, For you to become a member, you need to submit your membership application, and then you pay your $139 in all, which, like I explained earlier on, is $129 membership fee and a $10 application fee. And then you fill out specific other information like your name, contact address, and all of that. So this is basically what you need to become a member. So there's really nothing, there's no too much requirement to becoming a member. So once you have logged into the PMI website, remember we have pmi.org. Once you've been able to log into this particular website and then you fill your basic details and credentials, then of course paid your $139, automatically you become a PMI member. And then if you now want to apply for the exam, you now need to fill out your project experience field, as well as your educational qualifications. And then also don't forget, you'll also be required to fill out your project management training requirement, which is basically the 35 PDUs that you earn at the end of carrying out your project management training. Of course, for us at CL Consulting, we also help applicants advise. We also give advice to our participants with regards to applying for the exam. So please, if you have any challenge or any issue with regards to application for the exam, you can simply send us a mail at support@clgr.com. support@clgr.com. And don't forget, we'll be sure to help you out, especially with advice on how to successfully complete your application. So these are some of the recommended preparation materials that we usually advise that candidates go through in the course of preparing for the exam. Of course, one is a guide to project management body of knowledge, which is the PMP guide, the 6th edition. The guide actually provides you with standard and authoritative definition, as well as explanations for principles, concepts, procedures, and processes in project management. So the PMP guide basically gives you an idea of all the concepts that are used in terms of project management. However, one of the major drawbacks of using the PMP is, sometimes readers have, complained that the PMP is, quite cumbersome to read, and then also contains general project management principles, which of course would be excellent if you want to learn about project management. But one down part about the PMP is the fact that it is not tailored specifically for the exam. So the PMI publishes what we refer to as the exam content outline. The exam content outline. So the exam content outline is the document that contains areas where the exam questions will actually emanate from. So you have a situation where there are certain things within the exam content outline that is not captured in the PMP guide, and then also there could also be some other things within the PMP guide that were also not captured in the exam content outline. So that's why the PMP is not specifically tailored towards the examination. But then of course, to be candid, most of the topics you need to be able to pass your PMP examination is within the PMP guide. Then we also recommend the Rita Mulcahy PMP exam prep book, the 9th edition. So this particular exam prep book will teach you all the tips and tricks for success in the exam, and then it also has a straightforward and easy approach to complex materials, and then also teaches you proven study techniques for over 20 years of experience, and provides you practice exams as well as exercises based on essential concepts. Now, it is specifically written for the purpose of the exam. So it is tailored towards passing the examination, and it is primarily tailored or focused on the exam content outline. So if you want a text that would directly focus on the examination, then you might want to get the Rita Mulcahy exam prep book. Of course, we're going to be leaving the link in part of our, in this course below in one of the attachments, so that you'll be able to purchase this particular text. Of course, one of the major drawbacks is that sometimes people complain that the Rita Mulcahy exam prep book is actually a large material, and they may not have the time to go through and all of that. But we strongly suggest that you also go through the Rita Mulcahy exam prep book. This will basically help you in preparing for the PMP examination. Then also we talk about the CL Consulting preparation slides. So this is basically the slide which we're using for the purpose of this training, which of course you will be able to download at the end end of each of these modules. So this particular slide is also quite comprehensive. We use the combination of the PMP guide as well as the Rita Mulcahy exam prep book to develop this particular slide. So in essence, it is a way to easily catch up on some key concepts as well as principles that you have within the project management body of knowledge. So, but one of the major drawbacks of using the CL Consulting preparation slide is that most of the things you have in the slides are bullet points. So you might need to accompany with other reading materials for a robust exam preparation. Then we also have the Head First PMP. This is also a very nice text, especially for people who like simple and everyday language, and then also who prefer pictorial representations. You know how we have those children's story books back in the years. So this is also another text that will help you illustrate most of these key concepts in pictures. So if you're the type of person who is more of a visual learner, then you may also want to take a look at the Head First PMP. However, one of the major drawbacks of using the Head First PMP is the fact that sometimes people feel that there's a lot of distraction, and then it also doesn't appear quite serious for a professional examination. So these are some of the recommended exam preparation materials that we feel will greatly help you in being able to accomplish your objective of becoming PMP certified. Now, talking about the PMP examination, so the exam is a 4 hours exam. So you would have to write the exam for a total duration of 4 hours. So recently, the PMI introduced what we refer to as 10 minutes break. So within the 10 minutes break, after you've written the exam, I think for about 2 hours, you'll be prompted to go for a 10 minutes break, which is optional. So you can choose to do your 10 minutes break, and then you can also choose to proceed with the examination if you don't want to take your 10 minutes break. So within the 4 hours, you're expected to answer 200 questions in all. Now, out of the 200 questions, only 175 of them are scored. So in essence, about 25 of those questions are considered pre-test questions. Pre-test questions in the sense that PMI is experimenting basically how to use such questions for future tests. So there's a chance that for some questions you will see in the exam that you have probably not seen before or learned before, that these are pre-test questions. But please note that the PMI does not distinguish between the pre-test questions as well as the questions that are scored. In other words, the whole 200 questions will be put and aligned together, and then of course you are expected to answer the 200 questions. So it is just safe you answer your 200 questions instead of taking a look at which ones might possibly be test questions and which ones might possibly be the questions that are scored. So the questions are all multiple choice questions, and then of course it is only one correct answer. So at the end of answering every question, you get 1 point for every right answer, and PMI does not have what we refer to as negative marking. In other words, there is no penalty for wrong answers, which is also another reason why you have to attempt to answer all the questions in the PMP exam. Now, once you've written the exam, the PMI would grade the individual based on what we refer to as the 5 process groups. So the 5 process groups that we have in the PMP are, we have initiating, we have the planning, we have the executing, then there's the monitoring and controlling, and then also we have the closing. So these are the 5 process groups that you have in the PMP, and this is the basis upon which the grading for the exam is done. Please understand that most of the questions you will see in the exam would come from the executing process group, which of course is where you're going to see about 62 of the 200 questions that you're going to see in the exam, which represents about 31% of the total examination questions. Then of course the next would be the monitoring and controlling domain. So the monitoring and controlling process group, here you're going to see a total number of 50 questions, and then also 48 questions from planning, which represents 24% of the total number of questions. And the knowledge area and the process group that has the least number of questions is the closing process group. So in the closing process group, you're going to see about 14 questions from closing process group, which is about 7% of the total exam questions that you're going to see. So after you've written the exam, of course, on screen, you're going to see congratulations that you have passed the exam. Or probably you'll see that the exam result is failed. Of course, we hope that it doesn't, become a failed attempt, as the case is. Then, after you've gotten that particular prompt, in other words, either a pass or a fail, then PMI will now send you detailed analysis of your results, which of course will now be according to these 5 process groups. And then the analysis will now be based on what we refer to as below target. Below target simply means that the candidate did not meet the requirements for passing that particular domain or process group. Then target simply means that you passed a particular domain. Then above target simply means that there's a distinction. So in other words, you did not just pass a particular domain, but you had a distinction in that very domain. Then also needs improvement. So needs improvement is the worst case scenario where we say that the individual did not pass the domain at all and might also need to do further reading as the case is. So this is essentially how the exam analysis appear, and like I mentioned earlier on, the moment you finish writing the exam on your screen, you would either see a pass or a fail, and then this is now analyzed in detail in the report that you're going to get subsequently in your email if you're writing the online exam, or you get it at your test center if you're writing the test center exam. Of course, it will also drop in your email as well. So for the PMP course, these are basically the things that are contained with the PMP course. So in essence, you're going to be taking a look at what we refer to as the process groups, the knowledge areas, as well as the processes. So that's also what we're going to be going through in the course of this training. So we're going to be going through the 5 process groups that we have in project management, the 10 knowledge areas. So there are 5 process groups, and then also we have the 10 knowledge areas as well as the 49 processes. All of these are things that we're going to be going through within the PMP exam syllabus, and that's essentially what the Pinbox 6, that is the Pinbox Guide 6th edition, contains. So the 5 process groups are initiating. Of course, initiating simply refers to all activities that we carry out in order to start the project. And then also you talk about the planning. Planning simply refers to all the activities you carry out in order to determine the how, the when, as well as how much your project will cost. All of these are part of what we're going to be discussing under planning. Then executing is where we do. So doing is basically talking about implementation. So this is where all the actions that are listed in the course of the planning is carried out. Then during the monitoring and controlling, this represents all the activities we carry out in order to check, to be able to determine that the project is on its right course or that the project has started deviating from the plan. And then of course, closing simply refers to all the activities that we carry out in order to bring the project to an end. And that's exactly what the closing process group focuses on. So we're going to take a look at these 5 process groups in the course of the training. Then also we shall talk about the 10 knowledge areas, which of course includes the project integration management, scope, schedule, cost, quality, resource, communication, risk, procurement, as well as stakeholders. We usually have a mnemonics for remembering these 10 knowledge areas, which of course we refer to as the IS core creeps. IS core creeps. So this is basically the mnemonics we use in remembering the 10 knowledge areas when we do the training within our training center. So the IS here represents integration, scope, and then schedule. Then the core represents cost, quality, and resource. Then the creeps represents communication, risk, procurement, and then stakeholders. So in essence, the 10 knowledge areas is core creeps: integration, scope, schedule, cost, quality, resource, communication, risk, procurement, as well as stakeholders. So these are the things we're going to be going through in the course of the project. So I want you to interpret the 10 knowledge areas more like things that you need to know. So PMI is basically saying this is the knowledge that you need to have to enable you effectively carry out your project in this particular order. And that's exactly what these 10 knowledge areas represent. And then also you talk about the 49 processes. So within the 49 processes simply refers to all of the tasks, or basically the things that we do in order to successfully carry out the project. So I want you to interpret the processes more like the steps that you need to take in order to enable you to effectively carry out your project. So these steps are now put into two major grouping methodologies, which of course we refer to as the 5 process groups, as well as the 10 knowledge areas, which of course we're going to take a look at much more later in the course of our deliberation. So if we take a look at all of this and we put all of it together, so this is exactly what we get. So remember, we said that there are 5 process groups, which are initiating, planning, executing, the monitoring and controlling, as well as the closing. And then there are also the 10 knowledge areas, which are the core creeps. That is the integration, scope, schedule, cost, quality, resource, communications, risk, procurement, as well as stakeholders. So those are the 10 knowledge areas together with the 5 process groups that we have in project management. So all of these other items you're seeing here represent the 49 processes. So these are the 49 processes that we actually have within the PMI, project management body of knowledge, and that's exactly what you're seeing in this particular window. So notice that, for example, during the initiating, there are 2 major processes that we carry out, which of course would include the develop project charter process as well as the identify stakeholders process. So in essence, PMI is simply saying that if you're starting your project tomorrow, 2 things first that you need to do would be get a document that formally authorizes the project, which is what we refer to as the project charter, and then do your stakeholder identification so that you would be able to understand the needs and expectations of your stakeholders. Don't forget that any stakeholder you fail to identify and determine how best to manage will cause you the most headache in your project, and that's part of the reasons why you need to carry out your stakeholder identification. And then after that, you now go into your planning, which of course would include to develop the project management plan. The project management plan is now the combination of all these other subsidiary plans that you're seeing here. That is the plan that we have for scope, for schedule, for cost, for quality, for resource, for communication, risk, procurement, and stakeholder. Bringing it all together is what we now refer to as the project management plan. So that's why if you notice that the develop project management plan is under the integration knowledge area. Integration simply means to bring together. So that's part of the reason why I told you that this is basically where we bring together all these other subsidiary plans that you're seeing here, and then together they would now make up the project management plan. So I want you to interpret the knowledge areas more like the factors that you need to put into consideration when you're carrying out your project. So basically look at them as the various aspects of your project that you actually need to consider to successfully carry out your project. Say for example, the project is to build a house, or you're developing an app for you're developing a mobile phone application, for example. These are examples of various projects that there are that we can use for the purpose of our illustration. It could also be that you're developing a particular software, or maybe you're developing a vaccine, for example. So all of these are various projects that, as much as possible, we can use for the purpose of our illustration. So if you notice, if you're carrying out any of these projects that I have mentioned in this very illustration, you notice that there are certain things that you need to worry about. There are certain aspects of the project that you need to be wary of. In other words, that you need to be able to determine how best to complete them so that ultimately you will successfully carry out your project. So those key things that you need to put into consideration, or those aspects of the project that you need to consider to successfully carry out your project, is basically what the knowledge area represents. So if we do a little bit of illustration, if I ask you what are some of the factors you need to put into consideration to successfully carry out these projects that we have mentioned or you're seeing in this particular slide, what would possibly be your answer? Yeah, notice that some of the things you need to put into consideration would be, you want to determine, okay, how much would it cost me to be able to carry out this project? So basically you're looking at the budget. Then also, how long would it take you to be able to carry out the project, which in this case we refer to as the schedule. So in essence, in addition to the budget, you're probably also taking a look at the schedule, which talks about how long it's going to take you to carry out the project. Now, beyond that, you might also want to be able to define exactly the boundaries of the project. Exactly what are we looking at? Now, that's what we refer to as the scope of the project. And then beyond that, you may also want to be able to determine what will the finishing look like. I mean, what would be the expectation of what would be the definition of done. All of this is what we capture under quality. So quality is where we talk about the fitness for use as well as the fitness for purpose. Then don't also forget that you want to be able to determine how to effectively communicate with your stakeholders. That's exactly what communications refers to. And then beyond that, you might also want to take a look at factors that may serve as limiting factors that will prevent you from effectively carrying out this project, which is what we refer to as risk. Don't also forget that you're going to work with and through people. And then also utilizing other resources, including material as well as non-labor resources to effectively carry out your project, which is what resource in this case now refers to. Then you're also going to be buying things, and that's exactly what we refer to as procurement. Here you talk about contract, you talk about having outside suppliers, vendors, which is basically what procurement management here refers to. And then don't also forget that you need to effectively determine how to effectively manage your stakeholders. Say for example, you're carrying out this project within your organization, how you're going to deal with your boss, how you're going to deal with the client, how you're going to be able to effectively manage the community, how you're going to be able to manage your co-workers. All of these are stakeholders, and like I mentioned earlier on, this is absolutely necessary because any stakeholder you fail to identify and determine how best to manage will cause you the most headache in your project, and that's exactly part of the reason why this stakeholder management is absolutely necessary within your project. So putting all of this together is where you now come in as the project manager, because what you do basically as a project manager is what we refer to as integration. So integration, like I mentioned, simply means to combine, to unify, to bring together all the other relevant processes or knowledge areas and use them to effectively carry out your project. So you can see how these 10 knowledge areas fit together and then comes together to enable us to effectively carry out our project, and that's exactly what the 10 knowledge areas refers to. So you can see within this we have been able to identify the various aspects of the project that we need to put into consideration to effectively carry out our project, and then putting it all together is essentially what integration refers to. So if we go back to this very illustration, so like I mentioned earlier on, these are the aspects of the project that we need to consider, and then of course this is the order of implementation. Of course, we need to first of all start and then determine how, then carry it out, check, and then of course bring to an end. Don't forget that it doesn't mean that your processes within your project are more like sequential. No, most of it in most cases is going to be iterative. In other words, it's going to be a cyclical relationship, or it's going to be a back and forth thing. That's basically what is going to happen in the course of our deliberation. So once you've been able to do all your plans, like I mentioned, you bring them together, they constitute your project management plan, and then of course the project management plan gets approved, then you hold a kickoff meeting and you start the project implementation. So starting the project implementation is what you're seeing in these very processes, where you begin to give instructions on how work is going to be done, you begin to capture lessons learned, and then you begin to ensure that all of those things you have in the plan is carried out. This is exactly what you have within these processes that we have under executing. Then don't forget that as this is being carried out, you're now checking each of these aspects of your project. You're checking the scope, you're checking the schedule, the cost, the quality, the resource, the communication, the risk, the procurement, as well as the stakeholders. So you're checking up on these factors in order to make sure that they remain in line with the plan that you have already created about how to effectively carry them out within your project. And if we assume that everything goes according to plan, once you're done, you bring the project to an end. So these and more are part of what we're going to be discussing in the course of this particular training. So what we have just done at this moment is just to take a high-level overview of all the processes. Remember I told you that this is exactly what your syllabus within the PMP is made of. So we've taken a look at all the processes, the knowledge areas, as well as the process groups that you have in the PMP, and that's exactly what we have done. So after this training, it is best you use this particular slide, just print it out and keep in the corner of your office, and then if you have a project tomorrow, you can actually run your project using this particular model by going through these processes one after the other, and then of course by the time you're done, there's a tendency that you would have successfully implemented your project. So remember, we said that there are 10 knowledge areas, then there are 5 process groups, as well as 49 processes in the PMI's project management methodology, according to the project management body of knowledge, the 6th edition, which is of course the current edition of the PMBOK guide. Okay, so this brings us to the end of the part 1 of the introduction to project management. And like I said, the essence of this part 1 is to give you an overview about what all of this is all about and what you're going to be taking a look at in the course of this particular training. I hope it's been quite informative for you. So this will help you to determine whether you want to proceed with this particular training or not, or probably you want to look for other options as the case may be. Well, if you like it, please buy the course, or if you don't like it, of course you can move on. But I quite appreciate the fact that you've taken out your time to take a look at this particular introductory slide and then also determine if it is best choice for you to proceed with the course or not. Now, don't forget that within this course, we're also going to be offering you templates that you're going to be using to carry out your project. And then aside from that, we're also going to be giving you over 1,000 examination practice questions that will enable you to practice and then also prepare for your examination. We shall also take a look at case studies, industry practices, business scenarios, and these are part of the things that this particular training would of course contain. And then it's going to be an interesting ride, and enjoying you to join us in this particular training. It promises to be quite informative for you, and then at the end of the day, you would absolutely appreciate it. So this is where we come to the end of this very part. In the lesson 2 of this very training, we're going to be taking a look at basic definitions that we have in project management by talking about what a project is. Then we shall also talk about the benefits of project management, also why projects fail. We shall also talk about the roles we have in project management. We shall also take a look at some other key terms like program, portfolio, as well as stakeholders, and then also talk about what we refer to as project management office. All of these and many more are part of what we're going to be looking at in the part 2 of our introduction to project management. Once again, thank you so much for listening.